That's Michael Jordan. That's the inspiration.
Yeah.
I'm a pediatrician, so I get to have some goofy stuff back there. I had this one kid who was wearing, an Air Jordan shirt, and he had Air Jordan shorts on, and it was actually, long story short, my daughter was doing push-ups because someone had said that he could only do girl push-ups. And I was like, no, there's no such thing as girl push-ups. And so my daughter, who's now 10, was 7 or 8 at the time, whipped out a dozen push-ups. And this other kid who was wearing his Air Jordan shirt and shorts, I said, well, you got Jordan on, you should do 23 push-ups. And he said, huh? You had no idea. No idea.
So Dr. Steve Silvestro, welcome to PedChat.
Thank you.
You are an award-winning pediatrician and host of the Child Repair Guide podcast, the Child Repair Guide podcast. There we go. And you're bringing the wisdom of the world's best child health experts directly to parents. This is timely and fascinating for me. I found you through this search to find guests for PedChat, or I don't know how I stumbled upon you on LinkedIn, and I'm having a kid myself in a few months.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. I have dived into the growth mindset as a parent and mindfulness, teaching our kids mindfulness and all these awesome psychological and philosophical themes that usually or historically I've just taught myself, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for producing some awesome content. And I'm looking forward to introducing you to at least this little community, hopefully bigger community in the future.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure.
My first question to you is, what did you want to be when you were growing up? Yeah.
I still don't know.
Michael Jordan?
Michael Jordan would be phenomenal. I was the kid that wanted to be an astronaut. I remember having all the space magazines and watching the movie Space Camp, as terrible as it is to now look back 20, 30 years later. And I did. I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted at some point maybe to work in politics. I had thought at some point of being a writer. I was somebody who had too many ideas, and I still kind of am. I went to college undeclared and took a smattering of everything. Some computer science, some psychology, sociology, a little bit of everything. And the story of how I got into medicine was that my freshman year of college, I had a really amazing biology professor who turned me on to the science part. This was somebody who would get up in front of the class and he'd talk like this. He'd be really engaging and really interesting about all the material. So that turned me on to the science piece. And then, as hokey as it sounds, my freshman year of college, I saw the movie Patch Adams, was inspired. Found out that he was a real person who was going to try to build a hospital in West Virginia that would be free for all of its patients. And I did some fundraising for the hospital. And I actually did it in some pretty goofy ways. To figure out I would take up the same cause as Patch Adams. And I found that in the main quad of campus, people would often sit at a table with a sign and ask for you to donate money to whatever their cause was. And they would sit and they would do their homework. And I feel like that wasn't really engaging enough to get people involved. So I instead would wear, the first time I did it, I wore a coconut brown and a grass skirt. And I had a lei and I had a bucket, and I'd walk around and really try to engage and interact with people. And I did it each year of college and would send in the check with some pictures and a letter about what I had done. And eventually Patch wrote back, and he lived in the area at the time, went to Georgetown for college, and he was in Arlington back then. And he invited me and some friends over to his house, and we started a clown troupe. We would go to nursing homes and hospitals. We would do a loop on the metro and just have fun with people and try to brighten their day. And so that experience really turned me on to the people side of medicine. And so those two things combined led me down on the path that I'm on right now. I still have too many ideas. I still have a whole host of things I would love to do. And it's just a matter of choosing which and what and making the time.
So what got you into pediatrics?
So for me, it was peds or bust, really. Partly because I had been partly inspired by this playful connection to people. I had seen interactions when we would put on red noses and goofy pants and Hawaiian shirts, where somebody on the metro there was one experience in particular where we were going down the escalator and there was a train at the bottom and it was getting ready to leave. And there was somebody 10 clowns back on this escalator and they had their suitcase and the train left. And this person started to really grumble, all these stupid clowns in my way. I missed the train. And then within a few minutes, Patch was just going down the line of everybody waiting for the next subway train. And he got to this person and she was really standoffish at first. But then within just a few moments, he had cracked that outer shell and really made a connection. And she was laughing and chatting it up. And then I watched her the next several minutes until the next train came. And her day was brightened. She was having a whole different experience. So I really saw the power of play and how it opens up a window both for kids and adults. And so I felt like pediatrics was going to be the easiest way for me to work that into my daily practice.
So what are some examples of how you work it into your daily practice?
So there are these neat little things called D lights, which look like a thumb that you can slide over your thumb. And when you squeeze it, it lights up red, or you can buy some that are green or orange or yellow. And what's really fun is that when you have a little kid who may not be able to take a deep breath, I can hold this in front and go and blow out the light. And then a child of even 18 months can figure out that you blow on that and the light goes out. So that's an easy way to get an exam done. I also have a few magic tricks that I work in. It's hard to demonstrate here, but put the speculum for an otoscope on my finger and stuff it and squeeze it and jam it inside. And look, it's gone. And then I find it's behind the ear. And I say, now watch. If you watch really closely, you'll see that it's going to jump through the air. We'll do it again. It's going to jump through the air and go behind your ear. And I'll do it again. We stuff it and jam it and squeeze it and it's gone. Look behind the ear. It's not there. Well, maybe it's behind this one. No, it's not there. Maybe it's on the inside. Hold on a moment. And I reach behind me and grab the otoscope. And I look inside. No, not that one. Nope, not this one. Did you swallow it? Are you sure you didn't swallow it? Let's see. And I open up really big and I look inside. And oh no, look, it was on the otoscope the whole time. I just got the hardest parts of most pediatric exams done right there. So yeah, for anyone listening, feel free to take that trick because it's a lot of fun.
There are going to be a lot of pediatricians writing that one down.
Yeah.
So what made you start the Child Repair Guide podcast then? How did you get into that?
So I had one night when I was on call where the voicemail that got to my phone was of a mom of a 15-month-old. And she was in tears. She was crying on the voicemail to the point that she had to stop and collect herself halfway through. And there was like a 10-second pause. And then she was able to come back and keep talking. And the thing that had her so petrified was that her 15-month-old had a fever of 100.8, which medically is kind of just barely a fever, right? There's an endless stream of other parents out there who may have the same worries and the same situation and same anxiety. So with the podcast, I'm able to reach thousands of people all with one episode and really feel like I'm putting a dent in the worry that so many of us feel as parents.
If a pediatrician parent is watching this and they were going to listen to one episode, what episode would you draw them to?
Wow. The growth mindset is one that I think is really important, not just for kids, but for adults. It's something that maybe a lot of pediatricians may have heard about and may even know a lot about right now. So some folks may not find it as useful if they already know what we're talking about. But the idea essentially that, in a nutshell, you can always teach a dog new tricks, that you're always growing and always learning. I think it is something that is really important for us to convey to our kids and for us as pediatricians to be able to convey to our patients that you can always get better, you can always improve. But also, there's another episode that sort of ties to that, an older one that I did that was called Change Your Family's Narrative. And it's along the same lines that a lot of times we as parents, but also just as individuals, use really defining words and phraseology when we talk about ourselves or our kids. So this particular episode, the Changing Your Family's Narrative episode, talked about how it may be really easy to say, yeah, that's my smart kid. This is my troublesome child. This is the youngest. She's the cute one and she gets away with everything. And when we define the kids in this little package, we then really color how we interact with them, how we respond to the things that they do. And we also, we shed those feelings, whether we know that or not, and the kids pick up on that. And it can sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that, if you've got a child who's in a stretch with bad sleep, and you're just saying, this is my bad sleeper, that's going to continue. And you're going to approach every night with this dread. And so in that particular episode, it talked about ways that you can change that narrative. And it's kind of tied into the idea of the growth mindset, so that you can always start afresh and take a new direction.
What ultimately pushed you to get out of your comfort zone?
It helped that I had a friend who did a podcast and still does a podcast on a very, very different topic. So it wasn't entirely a foreign idea to me, but you're right. I needed to really just say, okay, I'm going to do this. And I think ultimately what it came down to was the idea of, why not me? I think that we all can sort of have this maybe imposter syndrome a bit, that even now I'm 60 episodes and 2 years into this podcast. And a while back, I wanted to have an episode where I spoke with a race expert to talk about how you talk about race with kids. And a friend of mine who used to work for New York Times and now works with Apple News and is fairly well connected said, why don't you try Beverly Daniel Tatum? So Beverly Daniel Tatum has written best-selling books. She was a former president of Spelman College, a historically Black college. She's a big name in the world of talking about race. And I wrote back to this friend and I said, yeah, that would be amazing, but as if sort of thing. And she said, why not? And so I just tweeted to her and I said, Ms. Daniel Tatum, I'd love to have you on. What do you think? And she wrote back within 30 minutes and said, I'd love to do this. And that has really been the experience all along, not just with reaching out to people that maybe I felt were a little above my pay grade, but just with the idea that, yeah, I can be the one who is out sharing this information with people. I can create videos and learn all the social media techniques to try to get them out so more people watch them, and have this presence outside of the four walls of my office. It really came down to, why not me? It's freeing in a sense. When you realize, it's almost like being a kid and becoming an adult and then becoming a parent, kind of realize that your parents maybe didn't get everything right when they were doing it, but as a child, it seemed that they did. And it feels that way too, working in this space with the podcast, that other people who are doing this, well, they're a podcaster, or they're on the radio, they're an expert. And they have all the same questions and doubts and thoughts about this as anybody else does.
I noticed that you have a few courses for sale. What made you start that? Was that another feedback-oriented idea, or?
Yeah, so the course is actually, it's on mindfulness, mindfulness for parents. I really fell in love with this when I was in medical school. I then spent my first summer after med school with the program doing research, and we saw how it impacted the students, how they felt that they were feeling more relaxed, that they were feeling better able to handle the stresses of medical school. That was actually one of the questions. I am able to handle the stresses of medical school. And it was a 7-point Likert scale. And we would see that the average would go from a 4 or a 5 up to a 7. We saw that the medical students felt more compassionate towards their fellow students. There was one question that said, I care about the struggles of my classmates. And that went from an average number, a 3 or a 4, up to a 7. And yet it didn't change how ambitious the students were. They were still saying that they wanted to do their best. So that also really piqued my interest in the effect that this can have. I later got trained to teach the students in the same program at Georgetown. And then when I was in practice, we had our second kid. My daughter was born when I was finishing residency, and my son came in the first year or second year of pediatric practice. And there was this huge disconnect because I was teaching this now to medical students, and we then brought it to undergrads. But I had probably the most stressful year of my life, with a fairly new job and a second child, and I wasn't practicing it. And so I had the realization that I needed to start to actually practice what I was preaching. And I began to incorporate it in my life. And, I wouldn't sugarcoat it and say that everything became amazing and easy, but things got a lot better. And so that, combined with the realization, it was around the time I started to think about doing a podcast, with all the anxiety that's involved in parenting, I adapted the material that I had learned to teach to the medical students and adapted it to teach it to parents, and expanded it so that the program that we did with the medical students was 11 weeks, 11 sessions, really only 10 lessons, and now expanded it to 17. I have writings and different exercises and recordings that parents can do at their own pace at home, because parents don't have a whole lot of time. And they can learn what mindfulness is. They can learn how it can benefit them and how it can apply to certain situations as a parent. Talk about different exercises that they can do, and I have recordings and whatnot of those. And then for most of those exercises, also have tips on how you can adapt those exercises to then teach these things to your kids if you have that interest.
Steve, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
What I would say would be to really focus on people. And what I mean by that is that I thought that I had been, and then I was, right? I was really geared into the idea that I was going to be helping people and connecting with people and caring about people. And I certainly had plenty of friends and whatnot. But I think that what can happen in med school in particular is that you're in this crucible, you're in this really stressful environment. And you have this carrot at the end of a stick dangling in front of you that you're going to get out someday and practice. And so we're all really driven. And again, you make friends along the way. But I think that when you get out, that carrot isn't always maybe exactly what you wanted it to be. The whole journey of med school and residency is very solitary. You've got to learn all this material. You've got to spit it out. You are the person at 2 a.m. in the hospital when there's no senior resident around who has to make the call. But then out there in the real world, outside of medical practice, and even partly inside, I mean, there's so much of what you may want to accomplish in life really depends on having close connections to people. So that would be the big thing. The other, I guess, is always just to always be open, whether it is to new people and new ideas, and to feel that there's not always a straight and narrow path that you have to walk. That you're not buying in to do one thing for 60 years. Everything is a drop in the bucket, and you fill the bucket in the end. And you may not know what role something has in your life until you get 3 or 4 or 40 drops into that bucket and you find out.
I completely agree. I'm on career number 2 right now. I started in the music industry, and now I've been a tech entrepreneur / marketing person for the last 4 or 5 years. And
yeah,
I completely agree. But my question to you in return would be, how then do you decide what to focus on? If you're leaving yourself open to all these ideas, right? Because that's one of the things that is a theme for me this year, or an objective for me, is to focus in on one company, one mission.
And I think one way you can look at it is that you have seasons. and that we talk about work-life balance and balance with all sorts of things. But in any given moment, you can't necessarily always have balance. And you're right. In order to actually have something that is going to be successful, this may be the time period. This is your season. This is the playoffs. This is, whatever. This is where you've got to really focus on this one particular thing to make sure that it launches. And I could say, that's how the start of the podcast was. I had several months where I was learning all the nuts and the bolts, recording interviews, reaching out to people, and really building up a bank of stored episodes. So I had something that I could get out. I was driven initially to try and get the podcast recognized by iTunes as their new and noteworthy citation. And there are certain things that everyone talks about you really have to do. You've got to have enough reviews and downloads and whatnot. And so, that particular season was very, very, very podcast focused. So I think it's probably the best way to look at it, that, there's a time and a place to be focused on one thing at a time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You pocketed that really well, or you conceptualized that really well.
Yeah.
For me, at least, personally.
Well, I hope that it's helpful.
Yeah. Steve, what books would you recommend for the community?
One book that has touched me over the years, it's older now. It's called The Art of Happiness. And it says it was by the Dalai Lama, but it's really by a psychologist who has written out many of his conversations with the Dalai Lama over many years. And they really delve into so much of the human experience, which I think is crucial for us as providers. It can be very easy to get wrapped up in your daily schedule, and I've got 7 checkups and 12 kids with a cough on a runny nose or who knows what, and think about each little piece, and almost forget what we went into this for. So I think that it's really important for us every now and then to really connect, to go back and dig deep and connect with ourselves, and really learn again how to look at people as a full spectrum and the big picture. One section in that book that really struck me, and I was younger when I had read it, was about death and thinking about death and coping with death, and which is certainly something that we all experience, especially in medicine. Yeah,
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's a really good one. Yeah, I can look real quick and see if I have any other books that are really great behind me. Oh, you know what? Actually, another book that I can recommend is 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do by Amy Morin. She was somebody that I got to interview for the podcast because her follow-up to that book was 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. And she's a really compelling story. That she ended up losing a lot of people who were very close to her in a short matter of time, and she got to a point where she felt that she could either wallow in this or she could move on. And she wrote a blog post called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, and it was essentially a letter to herself on how she could refortify her own inner strength. And make it through this at the same time, without necessarily just forgetting and not fully feeling those feelings. But it ended up going mega viral with millions of shares. She got a TED Talk out of it. She wrote a book. Now she has a parenting version, 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. And they're both excellent. I've begun to recommend the parenting book to a lot of the families that I see, because she covers many of the topics, many of the internal struggles that so many of us feel as parents. That would be another episode of the podcast I would recommend, and you get sort of a Cliff's Notes version of the book. Yeah.
Awesome. I will be reading that one as well. I'm going to go to Amazon right after this. I find myself doing that after these episodes, is going straight to smile.amazon.com. And
I do the same. With many of my guests.
What advice would you give pediatricians who feel stuck?
Yeah. with pediatricians in particular, I think that so many of us go into pediatrics because we want the connection. We love the idea of bonding with families, helping them as their kids grow, and maybe even doing the whole Norman Rockwell thing where you are then taking care of the kids that you took care of someday. But the day-to-day business side and logistics of a practice carve into that. So you can absolutely lose sight of that as time goes on, and you can start to feel very stuck. So I think stuck is a very appropriate word. What I would recommend is to really, some of the recommendations that you would give to somebody who wants to start a business or something. Think about what it is that you really love, whether it is about what you're currently doing, or outside of practice. What really turns you on, and how can you make that work in your life? One of the exercises that we do in the Mindfulness for Parents course is not mindfulness per se, but it's towards the end where ideally the participants have already started to build up a self-awareness. And I call it the 80-20 exercise. And I'll fully admit that I borrowed this from Tim Ferriss, who wrote the 4-Hour Work Week, and he's a big guy. And the idea is that you write down the 20% of things that cause 80% of your frustration. And the same thing, you do 20% of things in your life that give you 80% of your joy. And so your task with the ones that bring you 80% of your joy is how can you increase your exposure to those things, because that's the stuff to focus on. It brings you most of your joy. But then if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling anything else that you feel may be sort of a negative feeling, when you write down the 20% of things in your life that bring 80% of your frustration, if you can tackle those, you're going to have the biggest impact on your life. And part of the whole mindfulness piece is almost like the serenity poem, right? You're learning to accept the things you cannot change, to change the things you can, the wisdom to know the difference. The things you can't change. So out of those 20%, if you can't change part of those, you've got to learn to accept it. Because the more that you battle that mentally, the more frustration and suffering you're going to create for yourself. But out of those 20%, other things that you can change, if you're going to feel frustrated by those things or complain about them, you almost have an obligation to change them, to figure out what you can do to tackle those. So the 80-20 exercise, I think, can be very, very insightful. And just like most things that we do in exercises like this, don't let your pen rise from your paper. Don't stop any thought that's coming out. Put it all out, and you'll be amazed at what ends up coming out on that paper 3, 4, 5 levels down on both sides.
Dr. Steve Silvestro of the Child Repair Guide podcast. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being a part of PedChat.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic.